Welcome to the Women Living Well After 50 podcast. I'm Sue Carrick, and I'm passionate about inspiring, motivating, supporting and informing women over 50 to embrace this exciting time of life. Health and wellness in mind, body and spirit are the foundations for living well, but there is so much more to a life well lived. Each week, through conversations with my guests, I'll be presenting topics that will help us all to live well and enjoy life. So join me as we discover new ways to become women living well after 50. Are you ready to start living? What are you waiting for? Let's get started. Welcome to another episode of the Women Living Well After 50 podcast. I'm Sue Carrick, and it's lovely to have you join me. Boundaries. Now, we hear about setting boundaries all the time, but it can be difficult to say no and not feel guilty. It can be so easy to spread ourselves thin across the ground, and then we're not doing ourselves justice and living life well. My guest today is Susie Pettit, and we're going to be talking about boundaries. Now, Susie has been helping women live lives they love for over 10 years. She's the host of the podcast Love Your Life show and owner of the wellness company Strength, Mind and Body. She's a certified life and wellness coach and a mum of 5 sons ages between 17 and 25. Susie is passionate about helping women live lives that feel as good on the inside as they look on the outside. She spent more than half her life living life she did not love as a people pleaser and codependent perfectionist. She reflects that it's as if she was trying to win an award for Martyr of the Year. That sound familiar? Luckily, she hit rock bottom and now has the breadth of experience to teach firsthand about setting healthy boundaries, beating your inner critic, conscious parenting, and how to use mindfulness-based tools to beat overwhelm and anxiety. She uses 2 foundational frameworks, her 5 pillars of wellness and the thought model. We talk about how to set boundaries, where to start the pushback you might get, and be empowered knowing you don't have to overly explain yourself. So let's go and join the conversation. Welcome, Susie. It's so lovely to have you join me on the Women Living Well After 50 podcast. And you're a ball of energy, and I can't wait to introduce you to my listeners.
Thank you, Sue. I am so honored to be here. I love your podcast, and I love this whole community. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, as I said, you're a ball of energy. So let's start by hearing a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and what has led you to the path that you're on now with helping women, in particular mothers, but you know, my demographic is probably a little bit older than that, but it's still the same principles that we're talking about. So over to you just to hear a little bit about your story.
Yes, it is. I am a life coach who works primarily with moms and completely with women to help them live lives they love, which is what I say. That's the name of my podcast, the Love Your Life show. And that is sort of I help women set up habits. I have a lot of background. I have a master's of education, and I have background in brain science and sort of understanding how we can use research in our functional lives to make everything better. And I like to say it's because I lived a life I didn't love for many years. So I'm 51 now, and I spent probably the first 35 years of my life not enjoying much of my life, thinking I needed to act and behave and do certain things based on other people's sort of rule book for me. And I grew up in America. I actually moved to Australia just recently, but where I grew up is a similar story to many, women that I've heard, is that we were really encouraged at a younger age to look externally for what was right. So, maybe you said I'm a ball of energy, and I'd have this, energetic excitement, and I would be told like, okay, be calm, let's be the good girl. Let's, not, roughen the waters or whatever it is. And so I really learned early on that my way wasn't the right way, and I needed to look externally. started sort of looking externally to my father and that guidance, then to school teachers, then to my first husband as to what was right and what was wrong, until I, around midlife, had a bit of I call it a midlife awakening, where I was like, wait a minute. I had a good friend pass, that we were living sort of parallel lives. And she got a diagnosis of colon cancer and passed within 2 years. And it was this wake up call for me that was like, wait a minute, like, whose life am I living? What am I doing? Let me just, and that really struck my foundation to a point where, I looked at, like, externally, everything looked fine. Like, if you looked at me from the outside, I was, a bouncy mom of 3 boys, and I had the house and I had the dog, and but internally I was not doing so well. And that was a moment to sort of just regroup and reconnect with myself and get to where I am.
And that's a very common story, I think.
Yes.
I'm shaking my head now. I'm 65, so I'm a little bit older than you are. But still, the same thing was happening when I was growing up. For example, women. I was on the cusp, really, when the women's revolution, women's lib and all that was coming. But I grew up in a household where women just didn't go for further education. Why do you want to do that? Because you're going to get married and have children. And you sort of went along with that. And I wanted to be a teacher, but I didn't follow that path because I was being the good girl, as you say, doing what everyone else was telling me what to do. And I think that fortunately, there's people like us, many women like us, who are now passing that message on to our daughters and, sons and daughters and grandchildren, that's not the way you'll find happiness, because really you've got to live the life of who you are. And what in your story, when you were talking about how I said you were a ball of energy, and you said, but I couldn't be that way. We're not living our truth. So, and so you would have been suppressed with all that wonderful personality, because we're supposed to be seen and not heard as children. And as you said, don't ruffle the boat. Let's just all go along being the same and just not, doing what others want us to do rather than what we want to do.
Yeah, which is why I love working with women. I call us the midlife warriors. I really do say I work with women 40 and over, because I want them to sort of have that midlife awakening, that sort of like, wait a minute, what kind of life am I living? But I love working with this age because it is a time when we get to rewrite the rules. And one of the most important pieces is to not bring shame on ourselves. This has been one of the most important pieces for me, I'll say, and it's to not sort of beat myself up for how I lived the first part of my life, and to just understand with compassion, like, oh, okay, I see why, a younger Susie was doing that, and why she felt that she needed to, be the good girl and sort of that, like, doing what other people did because that was safe for her. So not having that shame of myself. And also, really, I see some people getting stuck looking at their past, thinking that they're sort of blaming others in their lives, like maybe their parents, whereas I have yet to meet a parent who is like, I want to intentionally screw up my kid. There's no one. They're all tried their best. So the messaging I was getting from my parents is from love. So it's just so interesting. Like, you were getting the message of, let's not finish school to be a good homemaker. I was getting the message of, go to school, get your education, find a husband, and then stay home. So I had this degree, and then I was at home feeling very unset, like, wait a minute, what's going on here? There are it's just all the messages we're getting are coming from a loving, protective place. Yes. And yet we sort of, we just need it sometimes to just take them, and it's like we're riding a bike and we need like a stick to go in the spokes to be like, wait.
So I said we were going to talk about boundaries today, and what I wanted to do first of all was something that I hadn't really reflected on much myself, and I'm sure the listeners haven't either. And you talk about boundaries being internal and external. And I just wondered if you could talk to us about what the difference is and just give us some examples about what's an internal boundary and what's an external one.
Yes, I love boundaries. So I define boundaries as guidelines for how we will be treated. So it's not something I'm doing to someone else, but how I will be treated. So an example of an external boundary is like outside of me. What's a boundary that I have is that I will not be yelled at. Like I will not be in a relationship where I'm yelled at. So say, you know, I was in an old, like my father used to yell at me a lot. So a boundary I said to him was, you know, if you keep yelling at me, I'm going to hang up the phone. Or if you keep yelling, I'm going to leave the room. It wasn't a like telling him what to do. Like he could keep yelling. You get sort of out of, sometimes we set boundaries that are like more from anger and like, oh my gosh, and get into this debate. Like, well, you shouldn't yell because, and I just drop all that. I'm like, hey, you can keep yelling, but if you keep yelling, I'm going to leave. This is like, I don't allow that sort of treatment to myself, or I don't allow people to call me names. So really at its core, a boundary is a guideline for how you'll be treated. So external boundaries show up in relationships, and they can be anything from what I just shared with the yelling. It could be, you know, I have the guideline that I like people to be on time when we get together. So if they're more than 15 minutes late, I might move on from lunch, you know, whatever works for you. It is a really, I say all relationships have boundaries, which is a sort of a shift from the sort of normal talk that we hear about boundaries. The boundaries are done more like in a punitive nature, like they're done once relationships start going sour. I like to look at them as they are the foundation for healthy boundaries. Usually when I'm coaching, if people are having struggles in their relationships, whether it's with their adult children or their aging parents or their, you know, longtime friendships, there is a boundary issue there. So that's helpful to look at, that it's a guideline for how I will be treated. An example of an internal boundary is then us saying to ourselves how we'll be treated. So a guideline, and this is very much in your work, and you've done lots of podcasts on this, like a guideline in terms of health and wellness. Like a guideline for me is that I no longer drink alcohol. And that's because it doesn't work for my system. When I drink alcohol, I turn into like a really angry, crazy person. Even like one drink, I just start seeing like the world is black and dark and everything's. So I'm like, that is not something that I do for myself. So a guideline I have for myself, it's like an inner Susie. It's like an, you know, a kind adult knowing Susie saying to this other part of Susie, it's like, okay, honey, I know that looks good to you right now, but that's not something we do. Or I have a guideline that I like to move my body every day. That is something that I do for my wellness, for my future self, for my mental health. And in the moment, I might have some, you know, like say I set my alarm for, 7 to get up and take a walk. When the alarm goes off at 7, there might be a voice in my head that's like, oh no, it's really okay. You can do this tomorrow. Me staying true to my internal boundary is very similar to the conversation I might have when an external boundary is crossed. Say my father yells at me and I'm like, oh, well, just this time, he has a point. No, like that's not a guideline for how I'm going to be treated. The alarm goes off. It's like, yeah, I know you don't really want to get up right now, but you will feel better later on.
Yeah,
so, yeah,
that's great. Yeah, and I love those examples that you've given us. But what I want to talk about too is that you talk about 5 pillars of wellness, and I would think that boundaries can fall into that as well, because I find a lot of women have trouble setting boundaries because we want to do things for other people. We want to be the nurturers. We want to spread ourselves so thin, and we forget about ourselves and our own well-being because we're wanting to be there for everyone, and we feel guilty if we say no, or we don't know how to say no, and in a way that we feel won't offend someone. So I was wondering if we could have a little chat about that 5 pillars of wellness, seeing that we've started talking about wellness.
Yeah. So I have 5 pillars of wellness, and sort of the first 3 are the ones that we often think about: food, exercise, and sleep. We think of like, okay, those things feed into our wellness. And then I also have a pillar that's self-care. So that would be things like maybe we like to read, or we like to, take walks, or some of those overlap with the first three. Like part of my self-care is exercising every day, or and then the fifth pillar is the one that we're speaking of, and that's relationships. And the most important relationship we have is the one we have with ourselves. We are going nowhere. We will have people come and go from our lives, and we are always going to be in relationship with ourselves, which is why the boundaries and the guidelines for how we'll be treated are so important. What you're speaking of is, this guilt over saying no, or what we call people pleasing, and what the other person is going to think, is absolutely how we were raised to think. That is, it is much easier for other people if we are doing things that make their life easier. So, say you have an age, like a child, and an adult child who just isn't really taking responsibility in their lives, and they just consistently want, to borrow every week. It seems like they're asking for another $100 or another $100. And you're just like, oh, I'm the mom. And you're thinking all these thoughts that are creating a feeling of responsibility and angst. And yet, this is where absolutely having a boundary that is like, what, I'm no longer, I have, my current situation is I have 5 sons. So I would say, what, I don't lend money to sons. Like, unless there's some sort of emergency and we're going to get it back, that's just a boundary that I have, a guideline. I will give you gifts. I will, but we're not going to have and then to understand that there may be some struggle, that's part of the challenge with boundaries, is that we think that when we set a boundary, the other person needs to be like, oh, okay, I get it, mom. Like, I get it why you aren't loaning me $100 every week anymore. Whereas in reality, oh, they're like, that was working really well for me, mom. Like, come on. I never had to think about, the fact that I was going out to dinner every week, and now I'm going to have to budget or whatever. But so that is one of the problems we get into with boundaries, is we make an assumption that other people think like us. And we need to continually return back to ourselves, our relationships with ourselves, and then sort of like our values. And I find that for women, again, ages 50 and over, we have been raised, first of all, we've been raised not knowing emotional intelligence. So not understanding that the way we feel comes from our thoughts, not the circumstances of our lives. So our son asking us for $100, we might have the thought, here he goes again, asking for a loan, time for me to reestablish my boundary and feel confident. Or we might have the thought, oh my God, doesn't he get it? He's always asking me. And we might feel resentful. Or we might have the thought like, oh, of course he gets to ask. Oh, look at him. It's our thoughts that are creating the feeling. It's not necessarily the circumstance that's creating the feeling. So that's challenging for us, setting boundaries, because we weren't raised with that. Nowadays, there's a lot more of that in the schools. That's, like, Tommy didn't make you feel bad. It's your thoughts that made you feel. We weren't raised with that. That's like foreign language for us.
Yeah. Go on.
Well, the other part is having support of women like you and your Facebook group and me, and listening to podcasts that are telling you you're like, setting boundaries is a very healthy thing to do. You're doing nothing wrong. We are actually going to feel like we're doing something wrong because we have been raised to be the good girl, to say yes, even when we mean no. And I actually call people pleasing people deceiving, because you're like saying yes when you don't want to say yes. And then, say a friend is like, can you come over and help me organize this baby shower for my daughter? And you're like, and you say yes, you don't mean yes, you go over, your energy there is not going to be like a pure, like, yeah, and she's like, what's wrong? And you're like, nothing, that's fair. That's not establishing closeness in a relationship. Versus you saying like, you know what, like, I love that you're having a baby shower for her, but that's not going to work for me on Sunday. And having that internal boundary she might be like, oh gosh, that's a bummer. Like it would have been easier if Sue was there. Yes, maybe. And she'll find something else, but it's going to be better for your relationship.
Oh, yes. And I think the other thing is if you've always been this way and then you are trying to change, it's going to surprise people. You're not going to be
Yes.
expecting of that because they'll be going, oh, I'm going to ask Sue this. And I know she's going to say yes because she always does. And then when you actually say no, they get a little bit affronted by that because they think, well, you always say yes, you always help. They don't think about perhaps, what it might be doing to you. And also the fact that sometimes, and I know I do it myself, I'm getting better and I'd want to at almost 66, but you sort of say yes and immediately you've said it, you think, why did I say that? I do not want to do it, but I've said yes. And then you get yourself all worked up because you either then have to go and say, well, I really don't want to do it. Or as you said, you go ahead, you do it, you're hating every minute of it, or you really don't have that energy to bring because it's not what you want to do. And you just get yourself all tied up in knots and stress and anxiety and everything. And who wants to live that way?
Right. And we sort of make up this story in our head. Like if you are at the baby shower and you're just like all stressed and we were like if you listen into your thoughts, you might be like, I can't believe she asked me to do this. And that was so rude of her. And like she has no idea this is going on. Like it is, she's just like, Susie said, yes, here she is. And then you're there with all this, like, if we could look inside your brain, it's like a black cloud, it's really unhelpful, which is why so much of this work is so important for our happiness and our well-being, because that creates inner stress. That is why it's a wellness pillar, because that inner stress, that's cortisol, that's a stress hormone. We know that raises inflammation in our body, and that shows up in, autoimmune diseases and inflammation and gastro, like it shows up in a whole bunch of different ways. So it is helpful. I think with those specific, when we're talking about what to do, how to break out of this pattern and how to be more honest, because it is, as you say, it's almost like we're doing a dance with our friends and we change the dance step and they're almost like tripping. They're like, what? Did she say no? I thought, like, what's going on? And so to sort of expect their surprise is one thing that's really helpful. I like having people try, and normally I do not, and I see that you don't either go by this word, but the diet, I talk about having a 24-hour yes diet. So I say to clients, tell people that you and your coach, and I can be their coach, just them listening to this podcast, they don't have to pay me. So you and your coach are working on a 24-hour yes diet. And so what that would look like is their friend says, hey, can you help with the baby shower? And they say, actually, my coach and I are working on having a 24-hour yes diet. So I'm going to get back to you in 24 hours. Okay. They might push you and say, well, I need the answer today. And like, that doesn't work for me. And like, but I need to know. And your quick, easy answer then, if they need the answer within 24 hours, then okay, the answer is no. I need 24 hours. What that allows, and that addresses what you're saying, is like when we do that sort of auto yes, that we've been programmed to do, to be that good girl, we have that pause to think of, okay, wait a minute, is this something I want to do? Is this will this bring me joy? This is a dear friend, or, no, let me tap into myself. It just gives us a little bit of a break on that pause.
I love that idea, 24-hour yes diet, because it does give you just that little bit of breathing space to think about it. And there's nothing wrong in saying yes if you really want to do something. It's when you're saying yes because you feel, oh, that's what I should be doing, rather than what I want to do. That's where the issue is, being able to make that choice on how you're feeling about whatever it is you've been asked. So I was listening to you on another podcast, because you've been on so many, and you were talking about boundaries without the bitchiness. And I'd love to cover that if you could.
For sure. Boundaries what happens in our lives is we can be sort of the givers. We can be the ones who are like, sure, I'll help at the baby shower. Sure, I'll loan you the $100. Sure, I'll drive you to the airport. Sure. And so we just get into this sort of over giving, like the give. And we can draw in some people into our lives that are the takers, that are and it's not, again, their fault. It's just this, like, it's easier that way. It's this like, oh, okay, well, if I need to ride to the airport, Sue, I like driving with Sue more than an Uber driver or more than the train. Or so they ask, we give and we give and then we give and give and give and we feel resentful. Mm-hmm. So that is, to me, I like thinking of our feelings as like little lights on the dashboard of our car. Do you call that a dashboard too, on your car?
Yes.
Like, yeah. So like when you see that little red alert light of like low gas or low tire pressure or something, what you're looking for with boundaries is the feeling of irritated, frustrated, annoyed. So when I feel that feeling of irritation or like she's asking again, or annoyed or frustrated, to me, that is a sign for me to stop. And it's a sign that a boundary has been crossed. And then my next question for myself is, have I ever said that boundary out loud? Like, has there been any part of me who has spoken up for what my needs are or what I want? Which often for us who we were raised with like, your needs don't matter type, like let's just go along to get along. The answer is no. And that can really bring in some resentment, because then we are making up those stories in our head of, this person should know that it's a lot to ask me to drive them to the airport on a Sunday, and like sort of thinking looking to them to do the work for us. And then we will set a boundary that sounds pretty bitchy. That's like, no, I won't drive you like you always have. And we come out like this, we sort of get pushed until we get to that level where we are more reactive, where someone will say, well, can you bring, a snack platter? And you're like, no. And they're like, oh my goodness, what's going on? And what's happening in your head is you feel like you have said yes 20 times more than you've wanted to, or 2 times more than you've wanted to. You're pushed into that level of discomfort until you do snap or react or
And I think that's the problem too. Most people that are people pleasers will internalize everything. They won't tell people how they're really feeling because they don't want to hurt their feelings, or they, don't want to not do the right thing. And so they sort of get to a point where they're this nice, quiet person, very pliable, very amiable, going along, and then boom, something just sets them off. And usually it could be something that you wouldn't have normally minded doing, because it's come on the back of so many other things. I think, you just react that way. But what I wanted to, a good point you raised was about thinking about what our boundaries are. Have we ever said them out loud, or maybe have we ever written them down? I don't think many people do. No. So how can we expect others to really understand us, or even understand our own behavior, if we don't know what our boundaries are, or what boundaries we want to set? And it could be boundaries for us, but also perhaps how we treat other people as well. Do we think about, are we encroaching on their boundaries? And so unless I really think that's a good point about actually saying it out loud or writing them down to reinforce in your mind what your boundaries are. Because if you don't, you're just going to be saying yes all the time, or you're not really,
you're going to be saying, I love that point. So I have, and I can share with you the link. I have an episode I did where I call manuals, and boundaries and manuals. If I have a little bit to just explain what manuals are, because it's super important. If you think of a manual as like an instruction booklet that you might get with a new piece of furniture or a new, computer or something, it tells us what to do with that piece of furniture. We often have manuals for the relationships we're in. So we might have, and they're not said usually, and they're not written, But in our head, we might have a manual of what a good sister should do, or what a good friend should do, or what a husband should do on Valentine's Day, or what a neighbor should do when new people move. We have all these sort of unwritten expectations for how people will show up. And those manuals of other people get us into such trouble if they are unsaid. If we say to someone, like, as a sister, it's like, you know what, like, I would just love it. Like, it would mean a lot to me if we talked on the phone every week, or, it would help me a lot if you returned my texts within like 4 days of when, something like that. But we often don't say it out loud. So I always say the best thing to do with manuals for other people is to throw them out, like to just throw them out. And we try to practice a little more unconditional love. Like, this is the husband I have. Let me throw out the manual of what I think he should be doing. And let me open my mouth as to what I would like him to do, or just, let him be, or my sister, or my son, so manuals for other people we want to throw out. So we usually have like these extensive manuals for other people, but then we don't have a manual for ourselves. And that's the one where I'm saying, spend some time there. Because as women, being raised to take care of everyone else's needs and pay attention to what our friends might need, and even what you were saying, like what their boundaries might need, like, we are not paying attention to ourselves. And that's where I find this sort of disconnect with ourselves in midlife, where we're like, what do I even like? Like, someone might be listening right now and being like, I don't even know my like, what are they talking? Sure, I don't want to be yelled at, but like, what else are some of my boundaries?
Well, yeah, and the other thing was, like you brought up, it's usually to do with, people think, I feel that people think as soon as you say boundaries, you're saying, oh, that's saying yes all the time, or you're putting up a wall or something like that. But you're one about, setting it where you've got your health boundaries, where I'm going to get up and do some movement every day at 7 o'clock in the morning. And that's a guideline. I like the way you talked about the fact that boundaries are guidelines, and that's something you are doing for yourself, for your health and well-being. And even though you try to talk yourself out of it on a cold morning, or if it's raining or something, that's the boundary you have set. That's the guideline and part of the manual that you've written for yourself. And I think that's just such a great point and a great idea of having our own manual.
Yeah, I think if listeners wanted to get started, like, just get out a piece of paper or a note on your phone, and just, like, I like to say, like, what's important to me, or what do I like? Just starting to, like, what do you like? I've talked to many women that they're like, I don't even know, like, if someone were like, where would you want to go to dinner? Like, oh my gosh, I don't, or like, what flower is your favorite? You're like, well, I know my mom and my sister's favorite, but like, what's mine? Oh, so that is a place to start. What do you like? Some people, that freaks them out because we've been taught for so long not to pay attention to that. So I say, on that same list, keep a list of what you don't like. That sometimes can be easier. Like, to just say, like, I don't like people calling, after 8 p.m. or I don't like, and that can help. Like, say that's yours. Like, you don't like answering the phone, after you've sort of like had dinner. That can be an internal boundary for you.
Yes.
People can call you all they want. You don't have to answer. There's the beauty. Like, people can text you, people can email you. It's this, like, looking at sort of bringing control back into our lives, but keeping that list of, like, what maybe is important to you, or what do you like? And then on the other side of that, like, what don't you like and what isn't important to you? Like, maybe you don't care if someone calls you at night, but you really don't like email. I don't know. I'm making these things up, but it's really, our power lies in learning about ourselves, turning the lens back towards ourselves. And at midlife, as our progesterone goes down, our progesterone is sort of known as that people-pleasing hormone. we get into a little more of this ability to be more inner focused and reflective and taking care of ourselves, and recognizing that I can take care of myself. That doesn't mean I'm doing something wrong to my friend. I can say, I'm not going to answer your call after 8 p.m. And that isn't doing something wrong to her. it is helping me. Instead of me answering the call, her wanting to talk for the 17th time about her son, who, and me being annoyed and irritated and, and I hang up the phone and then I'm snippy with my husband. And then maybe I stay up later than I wanted. So you're like crossing boundaries all over the place. And then those boundaries come with bitchiness, where it's that like, well, I have to get off the phone. And she's like, whoa, why'd you even answer? You're like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, and then that sort of really affects the relationships that we have, and then you feel bad about the way you've reacted, and it just becomes a vicious circle. But the other thing I find is that when you do set the boundaries, you stick with the boundaries, and even if it is something simple like being able to say no to something that you don't want to do, you gain this power, this inner power and strength. And so the more you do it, the more you can control what you do and what you don't want to do. And that brings a bit of peace, but power and strength, I think, as well, because you've had that strength to say, not on this occasion, thank you, or whatever.
Yeah.
And, I do think that builds your self-confidence, builds your inner strength, gives you that sense of power.
Well, and it builds your relationships. And this is the part that I don't want to skip over, because sometimes we can think, oh, it sounds so harsh. But one of the factors that leads to our life satisfaction, certainly as we age, is the depth of our friendships. And earlier you were talking about that nice, quiet person that just sort of gets along and goes along and says yes until she reacts out. That nice, that nice, quiet person who's saying yes often feels very unheard inside. Like that it's like, does anyone get me? It's this emotional loneliness of, is anyone listening to me? And sometimes it can be because she's not speaking up for herself. And that's where the power and the peace comes from, to sort of try those little steps to what it like feels scary to our sort of our nervous system. It's like, oh my gosh, I could never say that, Susie or Sue. And it's like, try it, because in saying and being more honest and more like you in these relationships, you actually get closer in the relationships that can sustain it. It usually relationships, it is like that dance. And so there's like that mixed step where they're like, whoa, what's going, and there's sort of like this, like any growth curve, there's a little bit of discomfort in the middle. It's like, oh, okay, that was so awkward to say that to her or to do that but usually what I see with relationships, it's the vast majority of relationships, they recover and they go on and they just have a different dance. But it's a closer dance. It's a more powerful, as you said, peaceful dance. And it's just, there's so much more connection there and not this emotional loneliness.
And I think that it sort of builds respect. You increase your self-respect because you think enough of yourself to be able to set the boundaries and to carry that through. But also in your relationships, people are respecting you more because they understand, well, okay, she's got her boundaries and, that's what we need to respect. And I think that really helps a relationship as well. It's not this person going on being the yes person all the time and the other person being the domineering one and the demanding one all the time. I think it brings it back into a bit of balance.
And that's where we get back to the wellness pillar of relationship. And your most important one is with yourself. And it's actually the Australian hospice nurse, Bronnie Rare, who she did a whole bunch of research on the top regrets of the dying. And one of the top regrets was not living a life more in alignment with yourself.
Yes.
And so that's like not paying attention to like saying, yes, I'll drive you to the airport, or yes, I'll do the baby shower, instead of like, no, you know what? I think I just want to take a walk on the beach, or like something. It's again, back to that relationship with yourself, that self-respect, that other people, they might not like it at first and they might come back around, but ultimately it's you and you.
And you're right. You've really got the only true relationship, I suppose, that the longest one you have is with yourself. So if you don't have a good relationship with yourself, then that's not helping you have relationships with others. But we've really covered a lot today. I think that there's a lot that our listeners can take away from today. I know for me, it's about, I think one of the main points is to actually stop and think about what your boundaries are, what your internal and external boundaries are, because write your manual, because I think that is, if you don't know that, you're just going along, you don't know what you're doing. Whereas if you just take that moment, and I find that women in particular, don't do that. We don't like to just take time out to actually reflect on what we want, what makes us happy, what brings us joy. Or as you said, if it's a little bit too hard that way, think about, well, the opposite, what doesn't make me happy?
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really good little bit of something that the listeners can work on after they've listened to the podcast today, because that's a really good takeaway piece for them to discover. Because as you say, you said to a lot of women, what are your boundaries, or what do you like to do, or what you don't, they wouldn't really know.
For sure. I love that. And I would love it if they sort of interact on your group, or if they on Facebook, or they ask me, or they follow up on Instagram, like just get it started, giving themselves the permission to ask themselves, like, what is important to me, or what might be a guideline to me? Like what matters to me?
Yeah. I think that's important too. You're right. If you are lost, it's so much easier if you can reach out to someone and who's works in this area, and they can help guide you. So I will be putting the links to your website and all your social media links and everything else, so that people can contact you if they'd like to reach out and just get that little bit of a help to get started. So we are coming towards the end of our conversation today. And again, I love talking to women, and women like yourself who are full of energy and full of good ideas, and I always learn something new. So, you're never too old to learn or be open to new ideas. But before we go, I did want to ask you a question that I ask my guests, and that you've probably answered it, but I still would like an answer. And what that means is, what does being a woman living well mean to you?
I love this question. A woman living well to me is someone who is living by her manual, who's making choices every day and enjoying her everyday life, whether she's on vacation or whether she's at home. I lived a life for many years thinking of like, I'll be happy when, or I'll be happy then, or like, what if all these pieces fall into place magically, but life is a roller coaster ride. And, really the name of my podcast is the Love Your Life Show. And it really is about trying to do things every day to bring in joy and lightness to your days. And I will share, I made a special handout for your listeners that they can find at my website. It's smbwell.com/Sue. So your name.
Oh, okay.
Where they can get my podcast roadmap that talks about sort of the foundational episodes. They will see that I've had some dark days. I have had bankruptcy. I have had family trauma. I've had a lot of it. And so I'm not saying this lightly, that like I in no way think that every day is like skipping through fields of daisies with rainbows on the horizon. And yet living well over 50 is all about trying to find moments in everyday life where we can find joy and happiness. And that can start with them thinking about their manual, with sort of the takeaway from it. And the
that's
diet.
Very inspiring. So thank you for that. And I will definitely be sharing that link. I'll make sure I've got that from you, but so that people can go to that special handout and just get started on living life their way. So thank you so much for joining me today, Susie. It's been a pleasure to meet you.
I've loved it. Thank you.
Well, I really enjoyed talking to Susie Pettit today about boundaries, internal and external, what healthy boundaries are, and our relationship manuals, as well as her 5 pillars of wellness. So I hope that you enjoyed the podcast. I hope that you will take a look at Susie's links and look at her website, listen to her podcast, and also share this podcast with a friend who would certainly benefit, I'm sure, because boundaries is such a difficult area of our life to get right, isn't it? So thanks again for joining me for another episode, and I'm working towards more women sharing their stories. So until next time, remember to live well, enjoy life, and most of all, be a woman living life your way. Bye for now.